Raymond Burr became famous playing a man who could expose any lie, but his own career depended on keeping one alive. To millions, Perry Mason was the face of truth, discipline, and moral certainty. Off-screen, Burr spent decades protecting a private life television could not safely name, including his long relationship with Robert Benevides. The public was given a different story: lost wives, a dead son, and a tragic biography that made his solitude acceptable. Why did America's most trusted courtroom hero need that fiction? Because in network television, a gay leading man was not treated as a truth to understand. He was treated as a risk to manage. Raymond Burr did not begin as the calm man in the courtroom. He was born Raymond William Stacey Burr in New Westminster, British Columbia, on May 21st, 1917. His early life did not come with the clean order that later surrounded Perry Mason. His parents separated when he was still young, and his mother moved with the children to California. The boy, who would later become one of the most trusted faces on American television, grew up across borders, jobs, and changing homes. There was no fixed public story waiting for him. There was only a watchful boy learning how quickly adults could rearrange a life. By the time Burr reached Hollywood, he did not look like the kind of man studios usually sold as romantic safety. He was big, heavy-shouldered, serious in the face, with a voice that could make a room go quiet without effort. Film producers noticed that presence, but they usually used it in one way. Before Perry Mason, Burr was often cast as the threatening man, the jealous man, the man standing too close in the shadows. In Rear Window, he became the neighbor the audience feared. In crime pictures and courtroom dramas, his size became a tool. Hollywood did not ask whether he could be gentle. It asked whether he could make other people nervous. That kind of work paid the bills, but it also trained him in something useful. Burr learned how little the public needed in order to believe a role: a suit, a stare, a controlled voice, a few lines delivered without blinking. If the package was convincing enough, the audience filled in the rest. That lesson would matter later when the role he had to play was not written on a studio script. It was written around his own life. The business around him was not built for honesty. In the 1940s and 1950s, a male star was expected to arrive with a readable private life. A wife helped, children helped, a neat romantic history helped. Even pain could be useful if it made a man look respectable. A lonely man with no clear woman beside him created questions. A lonely man with a tragic past created sympathy. Burr understood the difference. When Perry Mason premiered in 1957, the pressure became much larger. Burr was no longer just a supporting actor with a heavy face and a good voice. He was now the central figure in millions of living rooms. Week after week, viewers watched him stand up, control the room, and force the truth into the open. He became the man who could not be fooled. That made his own secrecy more dangerous. The public trusted Perry Mason because he seemed clean, steady, and morally certain. The network needed Raymond Burr to look the same way. But Burr's real private life did not fit what American television wanted to sell. He was not the lonely widower the magazines would later describe. He was a man trying to survive inside a system that could turn one rumor into a canceled contract. A studio did not need to make a public statement to end a career. It could simply stop calling. A sponsor could step away. A magazine could print one careful sentence, and the audience that had welcomed him every week could begin looking at him differently. So Burr learned to manage access. Interviews had limits. Personal questions hit a wall. He gave the press enough sadness to explain his solitude, but not enough detail for them to touch the truth. That was the hard trick. He could not look too happy alone. He could not look too available. He had to seem wounded in a way the public understood. If America believed his heart had already been broken by women and family loss, then his lack of a visible wife became less suspicious. It became noble. It became private grief. This was not a small lie told once and forgotten. It became a second career running beside the first one. On camera, Burr solved cases. Off camera, he protected the one case no one was allowed to open. The face that looked so steady under courtroom lights was also the face of a man measuring every answer before it left his mouth. He knew the rules. In that era, truth could cost him everything. So he built a biography strong enough to keep the questions outside the door. The public version of Raymond Burr's life did not appear all at once. It was built in layers, one careful answer at a time. The most important layer was the story of a wife named Annette Sutherland. In interviews, Burr described her as a Scottish actress, the woman he had married before fame settled around him. The story carried a heavy wartime ending. He said she had been aboard BOAC Flight 777 in 1943, the civilian flight brought down over the Bay of Biscay, the same flight that took the life of actor Leslie Howard. It was a story few reporters wanted to challenge. A wartime loss had a kind of social protection around it. Asking too many questions could make a journalist look cruel, not curious. That was what made the story so effective. It attached Burr's private sorrow to a real public disaster. The flight existed. Leslie Howard's passing was documented. The war gave the story weight before anyone had time to examine the woman at the center of it. Burr did not need to explain why he was alone in the usual Hollywood way. He could point to grief. He could let the press imagine a young husband permanently marked by loss. For a television actor whose private life could not safely be described, that invented grief became useful. It gave his solitude a shape America already knew how to respect. His false biography made him safer to sell. It turned the suspicious bachelor into the wounded widower. It made his distance from women look like loyalty to memory instead of evidence of another private life. In the plain language of television business, grief was easier to market than honesty. The harder part is that Burr had to keep wearing the story. Every interview became a test. Every personal question carried risk. If he sounded too cold, the lie might crack. If he gave too much detail, someone might check it. So he stayed controlled. He let sorrow explain the locked rooms. He let the public believe the man behind Perry Mason was not hiding love, but mourning what had been taken from him. It was a cruel bargain, but it worked. America did not ask too many questions of a man it had already decided to pity. Then came the second layer. Burr also spoke of a son named Michael Evan Burr, said to be the child of that first marriage. In the version the public received, Michael had become ill and passed away young. Burr described taking him on a final trip across the country. a story shaped to stop any further probing. A lost wife made him sympathetic. A lost child made him untouchable. Once that detail entered the room, most reporters had no appetite to press him about dating, marriage, or the absence of women in his life. The sadness did the work for him. That story, too, failed under later examination. Researchers did not find the basic records that should have supported the story of a child under that name. No firm birth record, no firm medical trail, no clear death certificate matching the biography Burr had repeated. The issue was not that an old Hollywood life had a few missing details. The issue was that the missing details were the center of the story. The wife and the son were not small mistakes in a press clipping. They were the emotional evidence used to explain why one of television's most watched men lived behind a locked private door. There was, however, one real marriage in Burr's life. In 1948, he married actress Isabella Ward. That marriage was documented. It gave the public something solid to hold. The relationship ended quickly, though the legal divorce came later. In a publicity system that often blurred fact and invention, that real marriage helped the other stories sound more believable. If Burr had been legally married once, then the press could more easily accept that there had been another wife before her. The truth of Isabella Ward gave cover to the shadow around Annette Sutherland. This was not just lying for sport. It was damage control inside a business that punished the wrong kind of truth. Burr was building a life in an era when a gay leading man could be treated as a threat to sponsors, networks, and family audiences. His false biography made him safer to sell. It turned the suspicious bachelor into the wounded widower. It made his distance from women look like loyalty to memory instead of evidence of another private life. In the plain language of television business, grief was easier to market than honesty. The harder part is that Burr had to keep wearing the story. Every interview became a test. Every personal question carried risk. If he sounded too cold, the lie might crack. If he gave too much detail, someone might check it. So he stayed controlled. He let sorrow explain the locked rooms. He let the public believe the man behind Perry Mason was not hiding love, but mourning what had been taken from him. It was a cruel bargain, but it worked. America did not ask too many questions of a man it had already decided to pity. The lie needed more than a few magazine answers. It needed discipline. Burr understood that the safest private life was one with as few openings as possible. He gave interviews, but he did not give himself away. He could talk about work, scripts, food, gardening, travel, and the pressure of filming. When the conversation moved too close to the center of his life, he could shut it down with a look, a short answer, or a silence that made the room uncomfortable. That was not an accident. It was part of the job. Perry Mason gave him power, but it also trapped him inside a daily routine that left very little space for ordinary human explanation. The show was demanding. Burr carried huge amounts of dialogue, often built around long legal speeches that had to sound calm, exact, and effortless. He was known for punishing work habits and long shooting days. That exhaustion became useful. If a reporter asked why he was not seen constantly dating, Burr had an answer that sounded practical. He was working. He was always working. The schedule was too heavy. The hours were too strange. No woman, he could suggest, should be expected to live around that kind of life. A man in Burr's position could not simply be seen building a life with another man and expect the industry to shrug. A look held too long could become gossip. A shared address could become a problem. Too many appearances together could turn into a question the wrong columnist might decide to print. For Burr, love did not arrive as a soft escape from pressure. It arrived carrying a new set of risks. Benevides also had something to lose. He was not a nameless assistant pulled into Burr's orbit. He had served in the military. He had acted on television. He had his own face, his own credits, his own chance at a public career. But a public career for him and a protected life with Burr did not easily fit inside the rules of the early 1960s. Two actors moving together through the same rooms could attract attention. That image helped the network too. Perry Mason did not need a star surrounded by scandal. It needed a steady man at the center. Burr's size, his voice, and his controlled manner made viewers feel that the room was safe when he entered it. Any detail that disturbed that trust was a business problem. Sponsors were not buying complexity. They were buying the promise that families could sit in front of the television and believe in the man speaking from the courtroom floor. Burr's private life had to stay outside the frame because the frame was worth too much money. Hollywood already had tools for that kind of management. One of them was the public date. A photograph in the right restaurant could do more than a paragraph of explanation. In the mid-1950s, Burr was seen publicly with Natalie Wood, who was much younger and already under the tight control of studio publicity. The pairing was useful on paper. She was a rising young star whose image had to be watched. He was a working actor who needed visible proof that women belonged in his story. A dinner, a smile, a few flashbulbs, and the gossip pages had something simple to print. No one needed the romance to be real for the arrangement to work. That was the cold efficiency of the system. The public saw a man and a woman together, and the machine did the rest. A reader at a breakfast table did not know who had arranged the evening, who had tipped off the photographer, or who had decided where the pair should sit. The picture only had to look normal. It only had to move suspicion away from the parts of Burr's life that could not be placed in a fan magazine. But rented safety never belonged to the person using it. Studio publicity could provide cover, then pull it away the moment a better story appeared. Natalie Wood's image soon moved in another direction, toward younger male stars who made more commercial sense for the audience her studio wanted. Burr was left with the lesson. The industry could help protect him, but only when that protection served its own needs. He was not being saved. He was being managed. That distinction mattered. Burr could not build a real life on publicity photographs. He could not rely on gossip columnists, studio fixers, or the polite silence of men who would abandon him if a scandal became expensive. He needed something steadier than a staged date and stronger than a rehearsed answer. Behind the work, behind the false family stories, behind the carefully arranged public image, he was still a man coming home after 15 hours under hot lights with no safe way to name the person he wanted beside him. The public thought it knew why Raymond Burr was alone. The public had been given losses it could understand. But the loneliness they were sold was not the same as the private life he was building. The real danger was not that Burr had no one. The danger was that he did. And soon, that private connection would become the most important relationship of his life, even as the business forced it to hide under job titles, contracts, and ordinary-looking paperwork. Around 1960, Burr met Robert Benevides on the set of Perry Mason. Benevides was younger, a Korean War veteran, and an actor trying to build his own place in the same business that had turned Burr into a national figure. On paper, it could have been a passing professional contact, one more guest actor, one more day on a busy set. But the connection did not disappear when the episode work ended. Benevides saw Burr at close range, not as the polished courtroom authority America watched every week, but as a tired man living inside a public image that had to be guarded at all times. That mattered because Burr's world was built around control. The studio lot had rules. The network had rules. The press had rules even when nobody wrote them down. A man in Burr's position could not simply be seen building a life with another man and expect the industry to shrug. A look held too long could become gossip. A shared address could become a problem. Too many appearances together could turn into a question the wrong columnist might decide to print. For Burr, love did not arrive as a soft escape from pressure. It arrived carrying a new set of risks. Benevides also had something to lose. He was not a nameless assistant pulled into Burr's orbit. He had served in the military. He had acted on television. He had his own face, his own credits, his own chance at a public career. But a public career for him and a protected life with Burr did not easily fit inside the rules of the early 1960s. Two actors moving together through the same rooms could attract attention. Two actors living too closely could invite questions. And in that period, questions did not stay harmless for long. By 1963, Benevides stepped away from acting. That choice is easy to pass over if it is written too quickly, but it carried a heavy cost. He did not simply change jobs. He moved out of the visible part of the business and into the hidden work around Burr's life. He became known publicly in safer terms: production consultant, close associate, business partner, the man who handled details. Those titles gave him access without forcing the industry to name what he really was to Burr. They also made his sacrifice look ordinary from the outside. That was how their life could function. A partner could be questioned. A business associate could be accepted. A lover could threaten the image. A consultant could stand nearby with a clipboard. The same physical closeness that might have looked dangerous under one name became harmless under another. Benevides could travel with Burr, manage practical matters, sit in meetings, and remain close to the center of his day. The public explanation was clean. He was helping the star work. That was all anyone had to say. This kind of hiding was not theatrical. It was administrative. It lived in contracts, call sheets, hotel bookings, tax papers, and polite introductions. Burr and Benevides learned to translate private devotion into business language. They built companies together. They invested in property. They developed their orchid business, Sea God Nurseries, which would become known for producing a large number of new orchid hybrids over the years. Later, they also became connected with vineyards and agricultural ventures in California. To outsiders, it looked like two disciplined men managing money and land. The arrangement was respectable and respectability was useful. But respectability did not mean freedom. It meant the lie had better paperwork. In public, Benevides could not be introduced as the person Burr came home to, the person who knew his fears, his habits, his physical pain, and the private weight behind the famous face. He had to stand beside Burr under a title that made everyone else comfortable. That title protected them, but it also reduced something real into something acceptable. The cruelty was quiet. No one had to shout. No one had to throw them out of a room. The rules were already sitting there, waiting to make them smaller. Burr's invented widower story gave the public a reason not to look too closely. Benevides gave Burr something the public story could never provide: a real household, real loyalty, and a steady presence that did not depend on magazine photographs or studio approval. Still, even inside that loyalty, they had to watch themselves. The wrong word at a party, the wrong guest at the house, the wrong line in a column could break the arrangement they had worked so carefully to protect. That is what makes their relationship more than a hidden romance. It was a daily operation. It required patience, timing, and a cold understanding of how the entertainment business punished people it claimed to love. Burr could win every case on television because the script was written for him. In real life, there was no judge to appeal to, no closing argument that could make America fair. There was only the next day, the next set, the next interview, and the man beside him who had agreed to be seen as less than he was so Burr could remain visible at all. Burr's private life was not only exposed to gossip, it also existed in a country where institutions treated suspicion as paperwork. By the early 1960s, the same America that welcomed him as Perry Mason still treated homosexuality as something shameful, risky, and in many places criminal. That is the part that can be hard to understand from a modern living room. Burr was not simply afraid of embarrassment. He was living at a time when one official file, one accusation, or one careless leak could damage his work, his income, and the life he was building with Benevides. He returned to television in Ironside, playing Robert T. Ironside, a San Francisco detective who used authority, intelligence, and pressure to command every room around him. The role gave Burr another long run on television and kept him in the center of American homes. It also gave the public another acceptable version of him, tough, wounded, brilliant, and alone. Once again, solitude was folded into the character instead of questioned around the actor. That pattern followed him for years. Burr could be surrounded by crews, assistants, producers, fans, and reporters. Yet the most important part of his domestic life remained carefully worded. Benevides was present, but the language around him stayed cautious. Business partner, consultant, trusted associate. Those words were useful because they were boring. They did not invite scandal. They did not force anyone to choose a side. They let the industry keep taking what it wanted from Burr while pretending not to understand the rest. The island and the orchids gave Burr and Benevides a private center, but they did not end the bargain. Burr still had to work in America. He still had to answer to networks, insurers, producers, and an audience that preferred its heroes simple. Every return to a set meant returning to the old rules. Every public appearance meant the careful face had to come back on. The man who bought an island did not buy his way out of the closet. He only bought a place where, for stretches of time, the door could stay closed from the inside. When Burr returned to Perry Mason in the mid-1980s, he was not stepping back into the same world he had left. That fear would have followed him into ordinary moments. A phone call that lasted too long, a letter arriving at the wrong desk, a journalist asking one question with too much confidence, a network executive hearing that there was government interest around its biggest legal star. Burr knew how quickly confidence could collapse in television. The same sponsors who loved him on Monday could become cautious by Friday. A network did not have to defend him if the pressure became inconvenient. It could call it a business decision and move on. But the return also placed Burr under new pressure. He was older now. His body carried the years. The camera could be kind, but it could not erase everything. A slower walk, a tired face, a hand resting too long on a chair. On a set, people notice those details before the public does. This was the period when Robert Benevides became even more visibly necessary to Burr's working life. Benevides had already spent decades moving through Burr's world under safer public labels. In the later Perry Mason television movies, that arrangement became easier to justify because he worked on the productions as a consultant. The credit mattered. It was not just a line on paper. It gave him a clear professional reason to be near Burr, to travel with him, to understand the schedule, to handle problems, and to remain close without forcing the press to name the private truth. The title protected both men because it made devotion look like logistics. Many of the later Perry Mason television films were made far from the daily noise of Los Angeles. Denver became an important production base for the revived series. That distance mattered. It did not make the set invisible, but it lowered the temperature. A production working outside the center of Hollywood could breathe a little more. There were still network people, crews, local reporters, and business pressures, but the rhythm was different. Burr was not walking every day through the same corridors where old gossip had lived for decades. Benevides could be present in a way that looked practical, expected, and official. The set itself became a careful environment. Burr was no longer just an actor arriving to say lines. That is where Burr's position became complicated. He was valuable. Perry Mason was not a small show. It was a reliable machine with actors, crew members, sponsors, and network money tied to its success. Too many people benefited from Raymond Burr staying stable, respectable, and untouched by scandal. If the wrong story hurt him, it could hurt them too. So the silence around him was not only personal loyalty, it was also financial caution. The industry protected the product because the product was profitable. Burr understood the bargain. He had seen enough of Hollywood to know that protection could vanish when money moved in another direction. A studio could arrange a date one month and abandon him the next. A columnist could hold a damaging detail in reserve. A network could call him family while quietly calculating risk. No one in that system gave him true safety. They gave him temporary cover, and cover always came with a price. Benevides became the one part of his life that was not built for publicity. That made the relationship more important and more dangerous. If Burr lost the public role, he could lose the income that supported their homes, their businesses, and the protected world they were trying to build. If the private truth became a headline, Benevides could be dragged into the same public judgment. The lie did not only protect Burr's fame, it protected the daily structure of their shared life. So Burr kept moving inside a narrow corridor. In public, he remained the serious professional, the widower shaped by loss, the disciplined star too busy for romance. In private, he and Benevides built a life through careful habits and cautious language. They did not have the luxury of being careless. Their relationship had to survive inside paperwork, trusted circles, and rooms where everyone understood more than they were allowed to say. The pressure did not turn Burr into a free man. It made him better at containment. He learned which people could be trusted, which questions had to be stopped, which doors had to stay closed. He had spent years becoming the man America believed could handle any case. But the case that mattered most was the one he could never bring before a jury. There was no public verdict that could clear him. There was only the ongoing work of keeping the truth alive without letting the world punish it. By 1965, Burr had enough money to buy distance. Not peace, not freedom in any simple way, but distance. He purchased Naitauba, a remote island in Fiji, thousands of miles from Los Angeles studios, gossip offices, and network conference rooms. For most stars, an island would have been a trophy. For Burr, it worked more like a pressure valve. In California, every dinner could be noticed. Every guest could be named. Every absence from a party could become a small piece of speculation. On Naitauba, the geography itself did some of the guarding. The ocean placed a hard space between his private life and the machinery that sold his image back home. The island did not turn Burr into another man. It allowed parts of him to exist without being checked every minute. The public knew him in a dark suit, seated behind a defense table, voice steady, face fixed, every movement controlled. Away from the set, he could step out of that uniform. He could work with soil, plants, buildings, tools, and weather. He could be a landowner, a grower, a man managing a place that did not care about television ratings. There is something plain and revealing in that shift. A man who spent his working life inside courtroom sets chose when he could to be outside with his hands in the ground. Benevides belonged inside that world too. In Hollywood, his closeness to Burr had to be translated into work. On the island, the translation did not have to be so constant. They could make decisions together without performing them for a reporter. They could talk about land, repairs, gardens, staff, shipments, and ordinary problems without the strain of explaining why they were always together. The island gave them room to build a routine that looked less like cover and more like a life. He would later sell Naitauba in 1983, but the island had already done its work. It had given him a rare stretch of distance from the business that watched him too closely. That did not erase the larger lie. It simply gave the lie less air for a while. Their shared interest in orchids became one of the most visible pieces of that life. Burr had loved orchids for years, and with Benevides, that interest grew into serious work. Their business, Sea God Nurseries, became connected with nurseries in places such as Fiji, Hawaii, the Azores, and California. Over time, the operation was credited with developing a large number of orchid hybrids. This was not a celebrity hobby arranged for a magazine photograph. Orchids require patience, money, space, temperature control, records, labels, and daily attention. A careless person cannot keep them alive for long. Burr and Benevides built something that demanded the same discipline their public life demanded, but with one crucial difference. The plants did not ask them to lie. That is why the orchid work matters. It gives the audience something more concrete than rumor. Two men who could not safely be called partners in public built a business around careful cultivation. They selected, crossed, named, transported, and protected living things that needed the right conditions to survive. The comparison is not hard to understand, but it does not need to be dressed up. Their own life also needed controlled conditions. It needed trusted people. It needed distance from careless attention. It needed legal language strong enough to cover what social language refused to name. In the open air of public judgment, their relationship could be damaged. In the controlled spaces they built, it could continue. He knew that a spoken truth could be denied, softened, or buried, but a legal document carried a different kind of force. After decades of letting the public believe in a family that records could not support, Burr made one final choice in writing. This time, the paper did not protect the lie. It protected Benevides. Raymond Burr's will was the clearest document he ever left behind. It did not speak in studio language. It did not ask a gossip columnist for mercy. It did not offer the public another tragic wife, another son, or another careful explanation for why he had lived the way he lived. The will did something colder and more direct. It left his estate to Robert Benevides and excluded his relatives, including his sister, nieces, and nephews. That pattern followed him for years. Burr could be surrounded by crews, assistants, producers, fans, and reporters, yet the most important part of his domestic life remained carefully worded. Benevides was present, but the language around him stayed cautious. Business partner, consultant, trusted associate. Those words were useful because they were boring. They did not invite scandal. They did not force anyone to choose a side. They let the industry keep taking what it wanted from Burr while pretending not to understand the rest. The island and the orchids gave Burr and Benevides a private center, but they did not end the bargain. Burr still had to work in America. He still had to answer to networks, insurers, producers, and an audience that preferred its heroes simple. Every return to a set meant returning to the old rules. Every public appearance meant the careful face had to come back on. The man who bought an island did not buy his way out of the closet. He only bought a place where, for stretches of time, the door could stay closed from the inside. It only had to look at the document and uphold the choice he had made. After a lifetime of being pushed into side rooms and safer titles, Benevides walked away with the estate because Burr had written his truth where the law could not easily pretend not to see it. There is a harsh dignity in that. Burr had spent his public life as the man who handled evidence, but his own life had been wrapped in stories that later fell apart under inspection. The missing wife, the missing son, the invented losses repeated until newspapers treated them as fact. His will was different. It was not a performance for a magazine. It was not a line designed to calm a sponsor. It was an instruction. The property, the money, the businesses, the private world behind the public mask, they went to Benevides. Perry Mason returns gave him something powerful. It returned him to the role that had made him trusted. The ratings proved that the audience had not forgotten him. Viewers still wanted the heavy voice, the careful questions, the moment when Mason turned toward the witness and changed the whole room. But the return also placed Burr under new pressure. He was older now. His body carried the years. The camera could be kind, but it could not erase everything. A slower walk, a tired face, a hand resting too long on a chair. On a set, people notice those details before the public does. Burr and Benevides had spent years cultivating them, and the business gave their partnership a public shape that could be accepted. After Burr's death, Benevides continued to carry that world forward. He did not need to shout the meaning of it. The facts were already there. Two men had built land, companies, routines, and a private history that lasted longer than most Hollywood marriages. In the end, Perry Mason remains part of television history because audiences believed Raymond Burr when he stood in a courtroom and asked for the truth. Raymond Burr remains harder to hold because his own truth had to travel by another route. Not through confession, not through headlines, not through the obituary pages that repeated old inventions. Many of the later Perry Mason television films were made far from the daily noise of Los Angeles. Denver became an important production base for the revived series. That distance mattered. It did not make the set invisible, but it lowered the temperature. A production working outside the center of Hollywood could breathe a little more. There were still network people, crews, local reporters, and business pressures, but the rhythm was different. Burr was not walking every day through the same corridors where old gossip had lived for decades. Benevides could be present in a way that looked practical, expected, and official. The set itself became a careful environment. Burr was no longer just an actor arriving to say lines. He was the reason the films existed. Everyone understood the value of his presence. Barbara Hale returned as Della Street, and her familiarity helped steady the whole enterprise. The audience saw continuity. They saw Mason and Della again, older but recognizable, still moving through the same moral world. Behind that comfort was a more delicate reality. Burr needed people around him who knew when to speak, when to step aside, and when to protect the small private spaces that kept him working. He was a man who paid heavily for being loved in a world that forced love to hide. If this story made you look at old Hollywood differently, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We tell the histories the studio system polished, buried, and hoped people would stop asking about.